From the three stories, what we can find out is that the young man was actually some sort of government official, and he was very rich. Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? It's kind of a heavy topic, particularly for us even today. It's kind of a difficult topic to wrap your head around. It's interesting in St. Matthew's story, the question is, what good must I do to gain eternal life? And notice the difference. In Mark, it's inherit, and in Matthew, it's gain. And keep those two words in mind. I'm sure all of us have thought about eternal life, or we wouldn't be here in this church today. But what about the Jews of Jesus' time? What was their view? There wasn't much written that has come down to us through the ages, but according to Josephus, who was a Jewish historian from the first century, there were three prevailing ideas of eternal life. The Essenes, who we believe John the Baptist was part of, and who we also believe were the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, held a very Greek view of afterlife, that the body was impermanent and destined to disintegrate, but the soul immortal and imperishable. And after death, the soul would be released, and those who were virtuous would enjoy a very pleasant, happily ever after. The second group, the Pharisees, were focused on interpreting the Jewish law for their own times and providing detailed explanations of the ancient words of Moses for life in the present, and working to preserve the holiness that the law demanded. According to Josephus, the Pharisees believed that after death, good souls pass into another body. That sounds almost like reincarnation. But it's thought that Josephus actually meant it was more like resurrection. The soul would be re-embodied. Wicked souls, on the other hand, would suffer eternal punishment. Then we have the Sadducees. They were focused on present worship, accompanied by a denial of that there was anything in life afterwards. The soul for them did not live on, and there would be no resurrection. This life was what mattered. And Josephus identifies the three prevailing beliefs of the Jews of Jesus' day as nothingness after death, immortality, or resurrection. And I think all of us have often wondered if there was some sort of positive thing that we could hang our hats on that would tell us that there really was something to this everlasting life thing that we know about and we hear Jesus talk about. And we hope the Sadducees were wrong, that there is really something after this. And I have to tell you that I struggled with that for a long time. And I'm going to tell you a personal story that I've never told publicly. When I was a junior in high school, I came home one spring afternoon, and my mom wasn't home. Even today, I can't remember a time that she wasn't home when I came home from school. So I had my chores to do, so I went out and I started to mow the lawn. And as I was mowing, she drove up, and she motioned for me to stop. I walked over to her, and she said to go in and get changed and get in the car. My dad was in the hospital, and he was dying. We arrived at the hospital, and we waited in the waiting room. And after a long time, one of the doctors came out and told us that he had finally been able to get some blood into my dad, but his condition was bad. And we'd have to wait and see when he woke up, if he woke up. See, my dad was a construction foreman, and there had been an accident. A truck had literally run over him. He had broken bones, massive internal injuries, and lost most of the blood in his body. He survived after 3 months in the hospital. And he used to tease me about not believing anything until I'd seen it with my own eyes. And it's even true today. He was right. I look for proof of things. I don't necessarily believe that everything people tell me, unless the person is unimpeachable. And fast forward now, 40 years later, I had gone down to visit my folks, and it was Sunday morning after we'd gone to early Mass. My dad asked me if he'd like to go take a ride. He loved to drive down to the Gulf. It was only about 30 miles. And we would drive through the marshland that teemed with wild animals and the marsh flowers, because it was springtime. And as we were driving, he asked me if I remembered that accident that he had been in. Then he proceeded to tell me about that afternoon in the hospital. He said at one point, it seemed that he was hovering above his body, looking down on the doctors frantically working on him. Then he said he saw a bright light, and a voice called to him. He said he saw his grandmother, my great-grandmother, whom I knew as a child, and then he saw some of his relatives. Then the voice told him he had to go back. It wasn't his time. And he said it was so pleasant that he didn't really want to leave. Now that sounds like something from one of the books about near-death experiences, except there's one thing I have to tell you. My dad couldn't read or write, so he was never exposed to anything about near-death experiences. He didn't know a single thing about it. But as he told the story, I watched his eyes, and I could tell just by watching his eyes that he was reliving it 40 years later, just like it was yesterday. But I have to tell you, my dad, unlike some dads from the time, he was very devoted. He devoted a lot of time to us. When he wasn't working and I wasn't in school, we were always doing something together. He was a man that because I had been around him so much, I knew him very well. He was a man of a few words and unshown emotions. When we'd go out, when we'd come back, my mom would always ask us, well, what'd you talk about? And we'd say, nothing. I said, well, did you have a good time? Yeah, we had a great time. Just being together was the important thing. This was a man who didn't tell embellished stories, particularly about any of his life experiences. I knew him in his own simple way, that he tried to lead a moral and righteous life. But more importantly, he honestly believed in his simple way what Jesus had said. See, he lived to be almost 94. And as far as I know, he never told anyone else about that experience. Probably because he thought that they might think he was a little bit cuckoo. But he knew me too. And perhaps that was the reason he told me that story. And for me, here it was. Mr. Skeptic. I had an eyewitness, so to speak, proof positive about eternal life. And it was just for me. So I could be doubting Jim no more. But back to the gospel, about the young man in the story today. He was disappointed by what Jesus told him he'd have to do. He was living a good and moral life, and he thought that God would reward him for all of the things that he had done. It was like he was collecting merit badges. The truth is, he was just going through the motions, doing the things he thought would earn him what he believed would be his reward for doing all the right things. But Jesus makes a really important point in what he says. Eternal life is not something you earn. Our merciful God gives it out freely. And he tells us the only thing that's necessary is faith and a personal relationship with his son Jesus. And for me, the greatest truth in the entire world is found in John's Gospel, chapter 3, verse 16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life.